and into Spain, and then where we're at right now is with the Abbasids, okay? And the key point you need to know with the Abbasids, we are at the twilight of their dynasty. They are beginning to crumble, and there's a variety of reasons to that, and we're gonna see a more split up version of Islam, okay? A split up nation, if you will, and multiple different caliphates are gonna emerge, and that's what we're talking about today. We call that Dar al-Islam, or the world of Islam. Okay? And in 1200 or so, right when we're picking up this story for the AP side of things, Islam is starting to fragment. And that is different from most of Islam throughout its early years. Early years, it was very united, it was very connected under Islam, under Muhammad, under the caliphs. That has begun to change. Okay? We already covered this yesterday. This was our context, right? That Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are beginning to shape what we would call the modern world, specifically Europe and the Middle East. Now today we want to focus on what the Abbasid Caliphate looks like as it falls apart, and what Islam looks like as it spreads. So we have to be aware that as the Abbasids fall apart, and they're facing different invasions from places around the world, the empire is too big. Stop me if you've heard that before. Right, almost every major empire in history gets too big and then it falls apart. So out of that comes like 4 different smaller caliphates, or states if you will. The first one is the Mamluks. What's interesting about this is the Mamluks are not like royalty. They were actually slaves and peasants in sort of what is known as Egypt. They were a military elite group who start an uprising and take over most of North Africa, specifically Egypt. They're also known as the Fatimid Caliphate, and they are most famous for being the one in control of Palestine and Egypt during the Crusades. So if you remember Saladin, okay, he is the leader of the Mamluk Caliphate. Okay, they become very powerful because of the military prowess and because they have Egypt, because if you have Egypt, you have the Nile, and that's important, obviously. Okay, so the Mamluks, that's the first one. Second one is the Seljuk Turks. Don't know much about their origins, but we know that they come from Turkey, hence the name Turks. And we also know that they are nomadic. What does it mean to be nomadic? Noah. You're roaming around. Why? Clay, help them out. You follow the food. Okay, so these people are famous for not having a home and typically being horsemen. Okay, but they do at some point convert to Islam, specifically when they conquer the city of Baghdad, which was sort of the educational center of the Abbasid world, the golden age, if you will. And when they do that, they kind of convert to Islam and convert to Muslim ways. It's very odd because most times in history, when one group conquers another, the conquered take on the ideals and the practices of the conquerors. This is the opposite. And the Seljuks will be famous for constantly raiding the Byzantines, trying to invade Europe. They're also at one point in control of Jerusalem. That's part of the Crusades as well. Most notably, they're ruled by what they call a sultan. No more caliph. They have a more local leader called a sultan who is just political. He has no religious authority. They're also very Sunni. So what can you assume if they're Sunni? Based on what we talked about yesterday. What's that? Fine. Right. The third one is the Delhi Sultanate. This is an offshoot of the Seljuk Turks eventually, but the Abbasid Empire had expanded all the way out to India. And when it gets to India, it becomes clear that that is just too far out for the Abbasid Caliphate to rule, so it kind of becomes independent. We call this the Sultanate of Delhi because it's also ruled by a sultan. Eventually, that ruler becomes known as a Shah. But they'll become a very independent area, and it's economically driven because of its location. India is very close to what that would help it be strong economically. Think about what we talked about the other day. Clay? Okay, they're by the ocean for one. The Indian Ocean trade network is growing, and the Silk Road goes right through it. What else, Elsa? What's that? They're protected. That's a big part too, right? By having the Himalayas. And we'll talk more about the Delhi Sultanate later on when we talk more about Southeast Asia, probably tomorrow. We'll talk about Hinduism. The big thing that's going on right now is Hinduism and Islam are colliding. Two very different worldviews, right? Based on what we talked about last Friday? Right, Hinduism, 330 million gods. Islam, one God and you better follow him. Okay? So we could have some changes in religious philosophy. And now I think the most interesting one is, oh, that's a picture of the Delhi Sultanate, by the way. Al-Andalus. This is located in Spain. Okay, remember back to the Umayyad dynasty in the 700s, they expand all the way through Spain and they try to invade France. When the Battle of Tours is won by the Franks, that keeps the Muslims at bay and they can go no further than Spain. However, many Muslim forces will stay in Spain and Spain will become sort of this hub of Muslim culture. In fact, the city of Cordoba in Spain today is still a great reflection of Muslim culture. And we have this really cool mix of Spanish culture, which is a lot different from the rest of Europe, with Muslim culture. It's also a great location for trade, being on the Iberian Peninsula. But there's two major buildings in Cordoba today that are in Islamic architecture style. The Alhambra, which is this big fort, and then the Cordoba Mosque as well. You've probably seen that. That was that first picture I had, being with the red and white arches. All right. What we see in Spain is a transfer of Islamic knowledge into Europe. Most notably, and probably most famously, the game of chess. That was a Muslim invention. But it's something that will become very popular in Europe for the rest of history. It's still played today. And I think normally we think of chess as like a British or a German game, a European thing. It is Islamic. And so what we see again is the fact that the conquerors, the Muslims are there, the people naturally take on a lot of these ideas. And that's probably the biggest key to know with Islam. Islam has such an expansive empire, and it is culturally so different, and many would say more advanced than Europe, that it brings a lot to Europe. And that's the next part that we're going to talk about, is economic transfer in these caliphates. Okay, any questions on that stuff? Okay, notice not a ton of specifics on here, right? We're talking big picture about these sultanates. I'm not going to get into who were the rulers of these sultanates, who were the rulers of the caliphates, no. But you do need to know what makes each one unique, where it is, why it is what it is. Okay, can I move on? Not yet, okay. Any questions at all on any of that? Just one more slide and then we'll move to something more fun. Okay? All right, so another big feature that we will track throughout AP is the spread and diffusion of ideas, technologies, beliefs, all of that, right? Cultural transfer is what we call it. When two areas collide and they exchange things. And that happens a lot in the Islamic Empire. Now, most notably, we already talked about the Battle of Tours, and that's a collision between Europe and Islam. When else would there be an exchange between Europe and Islam? There's one major one. Bryce. The Crusades. Right, when the Christians went to try to retake Jerusalem in about the 1000s or so, they saw all these different things that the Muslims were doing, and they're like, hey, why are we doing this? It actually leads to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all sorts of different things. So let's talk about some of these transfers. Okay, with the Abbasids, Dar al-Islam, the Muslim world, is a leader worldwide when it comes to academic and technological developments. So, for example, they have the world's first universities. Now, you could argue that the Greeks had something like this with their gymnasiums and that the Romans perpetuated this. Yes, to a point they did. But to have an actual place that was meant for further academic study. Not just like teaching you trades, but more like, hey, you want to be smart? Come here. So in Baghdad, there was this big building called the House of Wisdom. You want to get wise? Go to the House of Wisdom. In Cairo, Al-Azhar University emerges as a way to equip nobles with the means to be a ruler. So out of this comes things like math and algebra. New concepts know but they got deeper with it. Nasir al-Din is famous for a lot of his concepts with algebra, things that you guys would do, like quadratic equations, the use of the number zero, concept of zero, I should say, not a math guy. When it comes to medicine, the Muslims were very advanced. Okay, you might remember we talked about the Greeks back in the day, back when you were freshmen, and that Hippocrates was kind of the first person to start looking at how the body actually works, and he set an ethical standard for doctors, the Hippocratic Oath. Are you guys familiar with that? Anybody know what the Hippocratic Oath is? All doctors, medical professionals have to take it. Anybody know what it is? Okay, it's this idea that when you're a doctor, you can't refuse a patient care. And no matter how much you don't necessarily like them or feel like they don't deserve it, if they are injured or sick, they deserve your care. That's part of being a doctor. That's a Muslim idea too, that no matter who it was, even if they were of a different religion, if they were in need of medical care, as a doctor or a medical professional, you had a responsibility to give them the proper care. If you look at this painting up here, that is a early form of brain surgery. Yeah. They would manipulate the brain a little bit to try to avoid migraines and headaches and things like that. The major thing that the Islamic world does in order to truly become this technological and academic power is that they make use of already existing trade routes. We'll talk more about this in Unit 2 when we focus on trade. But they use the Silk Road. The big thing they get from the Silk Road, from the Tang Dynasty, gunpowder. So now not only are they trading, they have a militaristic advantage over everyone else. We'll talk about that in Unit 3 with gunpowder empires. We'll find that the Arab professors and those who study the academics will rewrite and preserve a lot of the Greek and Roman texts that have been lost in the European world. When we talk about Europe next week, we'll remind you of how dumb Europe was after the fall of Rome, the fact that they all didn't read, and some of these things could have been lost if it wasn't for the Arab scholars who rewrote them, translated them, and preserved them. That we rediscovered during the Crusades. The big thing is that in Al-Andalus in Spain, we have a two-way exchange between Europe and Islam. In Al-Andalus in Spain, we will see these texts preserved. We will see things like the emergence of a dhow ship. A dhow ship was a boat that had a curved sail, the lateen sail, so it could use the wind for both directions, so you could travel fast and actually in the open sea. Europeans will begin using that style of sail in about 100 years or so when they start exploring. Wouldn't have been able to do it without the Muslims. Ibn Rashid, he's an Islamic historian that records a lot of this, so we know about that. And then finally, as we mentioned before, Al-Andalus in particular is a collision of European and Muslim art. And still today, it remains that. Okay? So that's where we're at with Islam. That's sort of our recap. That's what's going on in the 1200s. You had this big rise with the Abbasid Caliphate. You had this golden age. And you had all this transfer going on, but now it's starting to fragment into these smaller groups. And we'll pick up that throughout the rest of this course as well with what happens next. But that's all of Islam for Unit 1. Yes?
What's the difference between Islam and Muslim?
What's the difference?
Yeah.
Islam is the overall religion and culture.